with your experience and with all these debates about hybrid warfare, about new way of waging the war, and for the NATO and for the allies, what is the future of the army? What is a successful army? What would it be in a couple of years now?
You're talking about the Ukraine army or army in general?
In general.
Okay. I mean, only because you mentioned the term hybrid warfare. I mean, this is a new etiquette, a new label for something which is not really new. Because what it means is you use all available means to achieve a military objective, and the military objective hopefully also has to support a political objective. Now, of course, the means have changed. Technology has advanced, and take only the internet as an example, or his camera. The weapons have changed, so the possibilities are different. And when you ask me what is the future of warfare, I mean, this will be continuously adapted to match new technological developments, but some principles still will remain.
On which stage we are, and the NATO is an ally, especially in Eastern Europe?
I mean, the NATO development, of course, has taken up those changes. The same is true for nations, because at the end, I mean, NATO doesn't have own forces, as you know. These are all national forces which are brought to the disposal of NATO. Your armed forces are in a process of reform, so you have to continuously adapt, bring in new technologies, react to technological developments. I mean, just let me take one example, which also has an importance in the future: boots on the ground. I mean, you can't seize territory, whether you like it or not, without boots on the ground. You can't seize territory with the internet, or with a camera, or with an unmanned area vehicle. You need soldiers who at the end are doing this particular job.
Speaking of, for example, European army, we've been talking about it for at least a decade of creating unifying European armed forces. Do you think it would change anything in the current crisis in eastern Ukraine if Europe would have a unifying army?
I mean, let me correct you a little bit. I mean, there are some people who talk about a unified European army, and they have the wonderful idea that through a European army you can save money and manpower, etc. But this is not reality, and there is no plan at all to establish such an army. I mean, this is vision. Like Simon Peres just said, imagine. But it would be a long, long way, because, first of all, it would mean that member states of the European Union would be prepared and willing to give up the sovereignty about their national armed forces. Where I do see no move in any of the European countries to do that. Neither in UK nor in France, and also not in Germany. Because everywhere the parliaments look at the soldiers of their nation. So what is being done really is to standardize better than this has been in the past, to promote cooperation, to promote integration, but not in a way that the result, at least for the foreseeable future, would be this one European army.
And how would you describe, for instance, the German army? There was a huge shift on the role of the Germany during the last years, and you know, the whole idea of German engagement in NATO. Now, currently, Germany is one of the leading country in solving the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, but how we consider that militarily?
I mean, when you refer to the German role in regard to the Russian-Ukraine conflict, Germany has a political role, only to avoid any misunderstandings. I mean, the German armed forces have done so far exactly what I mentioned earlier. They have adapted to the new situation, to the new security political situation. They have, or are in the process of absorbing new technology to take up developments in that area. As you know, we have had significant reductions over the last roughly 20 years. I mean, after German unification, only the Bundeswehr, the army of Western Germany, was still around 450,000. Now we have a total of 170,000 or 175,000. So there has been a lot of restructuring, a lot of adaptation, which of course means new processes, a shift in training, a shift in education, without giving up certain principles.
General, you were in NATO running, especially in the Eastern Europe, the Chief of Staff. So what were the mistakes to be avoided, and what are the key things to be done for the new states who are becoming the NATO members?
I mean, in those states which have become NATO members in the meantime, I mean, they all have gone through a very difficult process because they had to change their system, they had to adapt to NATO standards, they had to modify their training, their education. And the most problematic thing in this process always is to shift the mindset.
So how you do that?
How you do it through...
And what is this shift about?
Educate. I mean, you have to become used to think yourself, to analyze issues yourself, to assume responsibility and not to look to someone and waiting until he takes responsibility. I mean, this is exactly what your president this morning also said. Assume responsibility, be creative, and this mind shift was one of the essential challenges, certainly in all those, but they have coped with it. And I mean, from my few contacts that I have with the Ukraine armed forces, they are in exactly the same process. I mean, there's a young generation also in the military leadership, which has grown up now in the, let me simply call it, in the newer situation in Ukraine, which have started, and many of them already have adopted to that kind of leadership philosophy, let me call it like that. So there is good reason to be optimistic, provided that this process really can continue.
I have just one small question. After the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, is the NATO enlargement still on the table, or there are a lot of doubts that this is...
I mean, the NATO enlargement in principle is always on the table since it was initiated. In practice, of course, like someone today said, I mean, you have to understand that NATO cannot take each and every country which says we want to become NATO members into the alliance without that this country has reached a certain stage of development, don't have any internal conflicts, have adopted to democratic principles, have good relation to their neighbors. So there's a whole catalogue of descriptions which NATO has developed in the framework of the so-called enlargement study in the mid-90s before NATO enlargement really started. And the principles, from my point of view, are still valid.
And what would you say? There are a lot of people who would say that NATO kind of failed to prepare for the Russian aggression, didn't really make it, ready to answer. That was said by many analysts.
Yeah, but I mean,
do you think it's fair?
What would you expect? The collective defense principle of NATO is restricted to NATO members, I mean, what you or whoever through such an expression more or less is suggesting that NATO should have entered Ukraine and defend against Russian infiltration. But for that, I mean, for anything that NATO does, you need the political agreement of all NATO members. There is no automatism.
During the time when you were in charge, what were the relations with Moscow, with Russia? Because Russia used to cooperate with NATO, and I mean now there is a clear confrontation. But what were then the words, the position of your partners back then?
They're very different. With the few partners that I had direct contacts with, I mean, there was cooperation to a certain extent, pure military cooperation, small exercises, meetings to discuss certain items, the same between NATO headquarters and Russian armed forces. But I don't think that this kind of cooperation was really something which was absorbed throughout the Russian army. Having said this, I mean, the cooperation with partners is also not absorbed in every niche in the German or British or French armed forces. But today we talked a lot about values. The value to cooperate between a variety of armed forces, from my impression, certainly was not promoted in the Russian armed forces, which as a consequence made it easier to promote in Russia those theses that NATO is aggressive and NATO enlargement is threatening Russia. Quite the contrary is the case.
And finally, we've mentioned that there is really nothing new in this hybrid warfare. It's just using new tools. But there is also debate, like, to arm Ukraine, to bring the weapon. The people would say it's not enough. There should be something, more technological, or what is too dangerous. But as a general, as a military person, what you would say to find modern warfare? What are the key things? Is it a high technology weapon? Is it the, the particular kind of army?
It's a combination. I mean,
what makes the state secure?
Ukraine is a partner country of NATO on the basis also of the NATO-Ukraine Charter, and there are a lot of bilateral ties between European countries, Western European countries, Southwestern, Northwestern, and Ukraine. From my point of view, we have to assist Ukraine in developing its armed forces to NATO standards, also in order to get them modernized. And then the big question, of course, comes in, and this is foremost a political question, what to give to Ukraine in terms of support. So I think what is not debated is education, training support through teams here or sending Ukraine soldiers to other countries. I mean, I personally am engaged in annual seminar with Ukraine generals and colonels in order to give them some education or feeling what it means to have armed forces in a democratic state. We have done this for 20 years now. The other question, of course, which comes in is equipment support. My personal assessment, because anyhow I can only speak on a personal basis, is that in terms of tanks, APCs, artillery pieces, respective ammunition, I think Ukraine has sufficient stocks. What might be helpful for Ukraine are force multipliers, as they are called, modern equipment in the area of command and control, surveillance systems, early warning, border surveillance technique, these kind of things. I mean, I can't predict whether sooner or later that kind of support will be given to Ukraine. You know yourself that this is really, in this case, a political question. A political decision must be taken, but from a pure military point of view, I would say this could significantly help Ukraine without creating the wrong impression that a lot of people are afraid of, that this is not necessarily Germany, but that NATO countries are upgrading in an enormous amount the Ukraine armed forces.
Thank you, General.
Thank you so much, sir.
Welcome.